In some of our previous videos, we've covered the brilliant minds who shaped World War II's outcome. The Eisenhowers, the Zhukovs, the Pattons, men whose names became synonymous with victory and strategic genius. But today's story is different. Today, we're looking at the other side of the coin. The commanders who had everything they needed to win, yet somehow found a way to lose. The generals whose decisions cost thousands of lives and changed the course of entire campaigns. Ranking the worst military minds of WWII is almost impossible, but we've done our best to compile the 5 most catastrophic failures of Allied leadership. See if you agree with our choices. Arthur Percival. Arthur Percival was the general responsible for what Winston Churchill himself called the most humiliating defeat in British military history. The fall of Singapore in 1942 wasn't just a tactical loss. It was a complete collapse of British prestige in Asia, and Percival's face became the symbol of that failure. Making matters worse from a historical perspective was Percival's appearance. The photographs of his surrender to Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita show a gaunt, almost skeletal figure in an ill-fitting tropical uniform. The optics couldn't have been worse. Here was the representative of the British Empire looking utterly defeated before a single signature was placed on the surrender documents. But appearances aside, Percival's tactical failures were stunning. His army in Malaya outnumbered the Japanese forces by nearly 2-1. Most military experts agree that attackers need at least a 3-1 advantage over defenders, especially in urban terrain like Singapore. Yet somehow, Percival managed to lose with superior numbers. His first mistake? He completely underestimated the Japanese. Like many British commanders of the era, Percival viewed the Japanese military as inferior. This wasn't just arrogance, it was willful blindness that would cost tens of thousands of lives. Next, he refused to prepare proper defensive fortifications. Percival believed that ordering his men to dig in would damage their already shaky morale. He thought that building defences would signal weakness. Instead, it signalled to the Japanese exactly where British troops were most vulnerable. What's more, Percival spread his forces too thin across the Malayan Peninsula. His units were positioned so far apart that they couldn't support each other when the Japanese attacked. This allowed the enemy to penetrate British lines repeatedly, isolating individual units and destroying them piecemeal. Half the time, Percival and his staff had no idea where the main Japanese force actually was. They consistently overestimated enemy numbers, sometimes by factors of 2 or 3, which led to defensive decisions based on phantom armies. When the Japanese pushed down the peninsula towards Singapore, they outmaneuvered the British at every turn. The weeks between the fall of Malaya and the invasion of Singapore Island weren't due to fierce British resistance. The Japanese were simply regrouping and studying Singapore's defences. Here's what they discovered. Attacking Singapore from the sea would be suicide. British naval guns and coastal fortifications made that approach nearly impossible. But looking across from the Malayan mainland, they saw only a narrow strip of water backed by marshland. The British had always assumed no one could attack from that direction, so they'd left it virtually undefended. Even worse, most of Singapore's famous heavy coastal guns were fixed in position, facing south toward the sea. They couldn't be turned around to face the real threat from the north. It was like having a suit of armour that only protected your front while leaving your back completely exposed. Of course, there were British and Commonwealth units that fought with incredible bravery. Australian and Indian troops held their ground against overwhelming odds, but their courage couldn't overcome incompetent leadership. Singapore fell in just over a week of fighting. Percival was filmed surrendering his entire force, an image that haunted British military pride for decades. He and thousands of his men endured brutal captivity in Japanese prison camps. Many didn't survive, but Percival, who proved tougher than his appearance suggested, did survive. In one of history's ironic twists, he stood beside General MacArthur at the Japanese surrender ceremony in 1945, finally witnessing an enemy capitulation after his own humiliating defeat. Maurice Gamelin. If Percival represented British failure in Asia, Maurice Gamelin embodied French collapse in Europe. As the supreme commander of French forces in 1939 and early 1940, Gamelin had everything he needed to stop the German invasion. He had more tanks than the Germans. He had more men. He had fortifications. What he didn't have was any understanding of modern warfare. Gamelin was a hero of World War I. In 1914, as a staff officer to General Joffre, he'd helped plan the French victory at the Battle of the Marne, which likely saved Paris from German occupation. His reputation was sterling. France expected great things from him when war came again in 1939, but Gamelin's mind was stuck in 1914. He believed World War II would be fought like World War I, with attacking armies being torn apart on defensive fortifications, wave attacks, trench warfare, slow, grinding battles of attrition. The problem was that military doctrine had evolved dramatically since 1918. Men like Charles de Gaulle, the future leader of Free France, had written extensively about combined arms warfare. Tanks operating with air support, and mobile infantry, speed and maneuver instead of static defense. German military thinkers had read these works and embraced them. Gamelin dismissed them. His first mistake was assuming the Germans would attack through Belgium, just like they had in 1914. When French intelligence reported a massive buildup of German armour in the Ardennes forest, Gamelin dismissed it. The Ardennes was supposedly impassable to tanks. The terrain was too rough, the roads too narrow. So when the Germans struck through the Ardennes in May 1940, the French were caught completely off guard. But here's where things get truly absurd. Gamelin's headquarters was located in a chateau nearly 40 miles from the front lines, and it didn't have a radio. Gamelin didn't trust radios. He thought they were insecure and unreliable. So he relied on motorcycle couriers, and believe it or not, carrier pigeons. Comparing Gamelin's command setup to modern military headquarters is like comparing a horse-drawn carriage to a Ferrari. While German commanders were coordinating attacks in real time, using radio communications, Gamelin was waiting for pigeons to arrive with outdated information. Many of his couriers couldn't even find the units they were supposed to deliver orders to. Those units had already retreated or been destroyed because they hadn't received orders telling them what to do. It was a catastrophic failure of command and control. By the time Gamelin was relieved of duty in mid-May 1940, France was already doomed. The Germans had broken through at Sedan, and nothing could stop their drive to the Channel coast. Gamelin had failed to adapt to modern warfare, and France paid the price. Have you ever watched someone in a position of authority refuse to accept that the world had changed around them? That the old ways no longer worked, but they clung to them anyway, because admitting change meant admitting they'd become obsolete. That's exactly what happened with Gamelin and Weygand. If you've ever seen leadership fail because of stubborn refusal to evolve, drop a comment below about what you learned from watching it happen. Maxime Weygand. Maxime Weygand replaced Gamelin in May 1940, and his appointment came at what might have been the most critical moment of the entire Battle of France. Could a new commander turn things around? Could fresh leadership salvage the situation? The answer was no. Weygand was another World War I veteran, and like Gamelin, he didn't understand that this was a different kind of war. His first decision as Supreme Commander was to cancel the counter-offensive that Gamelin had finally approved. Instead of striking back immediately, Weygand wanted to study the situation. For 2 full days, Weygand held meetings with diplomats and dignitaries in Paris. He expected the Germans to pause like they had in 1914, giving him time to organize a proper defense. But the Germans didn't pause. During those 48 hours that Weygand spent attending receptions and reviewing plans, German panzer divisions were regrouping and preparing their next offensive. By the time Weygand was ready to act, it was too late. The Germans had already cut off the best French and British divisions in Belgium. The rest, as they say, is history. France fell in just 6 weeks. The supposedly impregnable Maginot Line was simply bypassed. The French army, which had been considered one of the strongest in Europe, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Both Gamelin and Weygand had failed to grasp a fundamental truth. Preparation matters less than adaptation. Having the best equipment means nothing if you don't understand how to use it in the current reality. Lloyd Fredendall. If you've seen the movie Patton, you might remember the scenes depicting the American defeat at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. That disaster was largely the responsibility of Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the American commander in North Africa in early 1943. Fredendall was facing off against Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox. Comparing Fredendall to Rommel is like comparing a Little League player to Babe Ruth. They weren't even in the same league. Like Gamelin, Fredendall kept his headquarters far behind the lines, sometimes as much as 100 miles from where his troops were actually fighting. But unlike Gamelin, Fredendall did believe in using radios. The problem was how he used them. Fredendall didn't trust standard military codes, so he made up his own, on the fly, and assumed his subordinate commanders would understand them. They didn't. Here's an actual example of a Fredendall order. Have your boss report to the French gentleman whose name begins with J at a place which begins with D, which is 5 grid squares to the left of M. Can you imagine receiving that message in the middle of a battle? Officers spent precious time trying to decode what Fredendall meant instead of maneuvering their troops. It was like playing a deadly game of charades while the enemy was shooting at you. What's more, while his men were fighting and dying in the desert, Fredendall was living in relative luxury. His headquarters included a well-stocked kitchen with food shipped from the United States. He had refrigerators installed. His personal trailer was buried several feet underground with an air conditioning system, and he prioritized installing creature comforts over positioning his troops correctly. When Rommel struck at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces weren't ready. Fredendall had dispersed them poorly, ignored intelligence reports, and failed to prepare adequate defenses. The result was a humiliating defeat that shook American confidence and taught the US Army some very painful lessons about combat leadership. American casualties at Kasserine included over 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing or captured. Equipment losses included 183 tanks, 194 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, and 512 jeeps and trucks. Fredendall was sent home in disgrace. But here's the kicker. Thanks to the West Point Old Boys network, he was given command of the 2nd Army back in the United States, responsible for training troops. One can only hope he learned something from his failures before passing on his wisdom to the next generation. Mark Clark. Mark Clark is perhaps the most controversial figure on our list. Unlike the others, Clark didn't lose any major battles. He actually liberated Rome in June 1944, making it the first Axis capital to fall. So why is he on this list? Because Clark represents a different kind of failure. Not the failure of incompetence, but the failure of missed opportunities and unnecessary casualties. The failure of a commander more concerned with personal glory than strategic objectives. Clark commanded American forces during the invasion of Italy, a campaign that many military historians consider one of the least necessary of the entire war. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill pushed hard for it, believing Allied forces could quickly advance up the Italian peninsula and enter Germany from the south. Churchill was a great wartime leader, but this wasn't one of his better ideas. Italy's mountainous terrain, narrow roads, and defensive river lines made it perfect for defense and terrible for offense. The Germans proved expert at using these natural advantages. Clark's first major mistake came at the Anzio landings in January 1944. The operation was designed to outflank German defensive lines and open the road to Rome. Allied forces landed almost unopposed and caught the Germans completely by surprise. For a brief window, the road to Rome was wide open, but Clark and his subordinate, General John Lucas, hesitated. They believed they needed to consolidate the beachhead first. They overestimated German strength. They waited for reinforcements. And while they waited, the Germans rushed troops to contain the landing. What should have been a breakthrough became a bloody stalemate that lasted for months. Making matters worse, when Allied forces finally did break out of Anzio, Clark made a fateful decision. Instead of cutting off retreating German forces as planned, he diverted troops to ensure that American forces, not British forces, would be first into Rome. Clark wanted the glory of liberating Rome, and he was willing to let German divisions escape to get it. Those German divisions that escaped went on to fight at the Gothic Line and in northern Italy, prolonging the Italian campaign by months and costing thousands of additional Allied lives. All because Clark wanted his photograph taken in Rome. Clark also shares responsibility for the disaster at Monte Cassino, where 4 separate offensives failed to break German defensive lines anchored on the ancient monastery. Frontal assault after frontal assault crashed against German positions. Polish, Indian, British and American troops died by the thousands, trying to take positions that might have been bypassed or neutralized through better strategy. Most of all, Clark was cautious when he should have been bold, and bold when he should have been careful. He seemed more concerned with not losing battles than with actually winning them. His personality didn't help either. Most officers found him pompous, irritating, and quick to blame others for his own mistakes. Clark didn't lose to the Germans in Italy, but he only won because he had overwhelming advantages in men, equipment, and air support. Against a more equal opponent, his record might have been very different. Conclusion. And there you have our list of the 5 worst Allied generals of World War II, from Percival's collapse in Singapore to Gamelin's carrier pigeons in France, from Fredendall's bunker luxury to Clark's Roman glory hunt. These commanders share common threads. They underestimated their enemies. They refused to adapt to new realities. They prioritized personal comfort or prestige over mission success. And in every case, their troops paid the price for leadership failures. These stories remind us that having the right equipment and superior numbers isn't enough to guarantee victory. Leadership matters. Adaptability matters. Understanding your enemy matters. And sometimes the difference between triumph and disaster comes down to whether a general is willing to accept that the world has changed. What's your take on these commanders? Did any of them deserve their fate, or were they victims of impossible situations? Do you think we missed anyone who should have made this list? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.